All right, last time we took a look at some of the capabilities of HTML5 and CSS to help us do validation on a form. Today I want to go, I don't know if the old school is the right term here, but this technique that I'm using goes back to programming logic beginning. It's the same kind of process. As I leave the field, validate the data. If there's a problem, show the user an error marker. The error marker then tells them what's wrong. They hover on the error marker. We saw that CSS can do some things. We saw that HTML5 can do some things. This works everywhere. Even if they're using IE8, this technique works. It does occasionally run into some glitches when we use it. For instance, the date validation I'm going to show you. When we do the date validation with a browser that has a date picker in it, the error message is occasionally a little off. Instead of saying it's an invalid date, it says you're missing the date. And there's really no way around that because the date picker itself returns nothing if you give it a bad date. So the JavaScript thinks it's getting a bad date. So we'll see some of those things. What we're going to do in our validation is create an onBlur event. And I can never type that. It's always onBlue, and it doesn't work. But it's onBlur, which is the leave event, the validation event in C#. When we're leaving, focus is blurring. We're not quite gone yet, but when we're leaving, on the way out, do some validation. Now, I never go back. There probably is a way to say set the focus back again if there's an error. But I never go back. I let the user go, and I just leave a little error marker on there. Same way we did in Programming Logic Intermediate. So let's start. I'm going up here in my JavaScript file to the very top. And before PTR value, what I tend to do is define these things in the order they appear on the form. You could rearrange them alphabetically, whatever you wish. I'm going to create a pointer to my user field, text username. At least right now, I'm only going to refer to it once. And so as long as I'm only referring to it once, I'm not going to create a variable for it like I did these other ones. These other ones I declared a variable so I could use the pointer over and over and over again. I'm going to define an onBlur event, and I'm going to set that equal to a function called validate username. No parentheses. Remember last time I mentioned it's a very common mistake for me. When you define event handlers, onClick, onBlur, we're going to have an on key press before we're done. Here's onClick. OnSubmit. And when you're doing that in form load, all you're doing is pointing to the name of the function that you want to execute when this event occurs. If you put parentheses on that, then when window onLoad runs, it actually calls the function and executes it and never links to it. So that's another very common mistake that I tend to look over your shoulder and I'll say, show me onLoad. And then I'll look to see if there's any parentheses after your function names, and usually before I see it, you do, and you go fix it and I walk away. That's a very common mistake. Another thing you can do here is collapse. I believe it's Alt-1. Alt-1 collapse to the first level. So that works pretty good in the JavaScript file. You can also Alt-2 and collapse just the second levels and leave. And then I think there's an Alt, I forget what it is, to put them all back again. Comment line, convert, indent. Yeah, it's in there someplace. I don't think it's part of the language, it's not settings. Collapse to the current level, uncollapse, collapse, uncollapse. Unfold all. Alt-Shift-0, that's what I was looking for. Alt-0 actually folds everything. So I don't use that very often because a lot of times there'll be something very small and it'll shrink this down to one line. But that's collapse, got things out of the way, so now I want to do validate username. That would fit here. Fortunately, I don't think I can click down there. So I have to click here, press return, and then collapse this again. This function ensures the user entered a username. So this is just a required field. Couldn't I use required? Absolutely. And I encourage you to use both. They get kind of redundant. In Firefox, remember, if it's required, we leave it blank. We get the little pink halo around it. But you really don't get yelled at in most of the browsers until you actually leave or try to submit the form. Then the validation of required kicks in. Our validation is going to happen on blur as soon as we try to leave that field. So you can mix and match these. It's a function called validate the username. And now I'm going to show you a couple of techniques that I use because a lot of these validation routines are very, very similar. In my form, you don't have to follow here, in my form, after every one of the inputs, there is an image that I call ERR as a prefix, and then whichever one it is, ERR username, ERR value. In this case, I kind of broke my pattern, ERR DTP. But these are just those little red exclamation marks that I stole from programming logic. And so every field has that image after it. My form layout CSS parks that image in the right place. It's just an image, but its style initially is set to visibility hidden, meaning it doesn't show up. That's why we haven't seen them. They're there, but they're all hidden until our JavaScript turns them on. Each one of those starts with an ERR. So what I do in each one of my validation routines, I need two pieces of information. I need a pointer to the object, because I'm probably going to refer to it 2 or 3 times. Is it blank? Is it out of range? Is it a date? So I need a pointer to the object, and I also need a pointer to the error marker. So I declare a couple of variables. I just use PTR. And in this case, that's equal to my txt username. Declare another variable ERR, and that's equal to the ERR username. And that line of code I can pretty much copy from method to method. Just change username to whatever it's supposed to be. There, nice and generic, so when I copy it, it's still well described. And now I just start using those in if statements. If my ptr.value, if the username's value is empty, then I'm going to yell at them. Otherwise, I'm going to do something else. Now, when I look at some of my past routines, this else, one of these is usually turn the error marker on, the other one's turn the error marker off. In my date routine, I start off by saying the error marker's on. And then if everything's cool, I turn it off. Because there's 6 places, 6 different ways you can screw up a date. And so that would be 6 different places that I would have to turn the error marker on. So instead of doing that, I start off with an on, and then turn it off if it's appropriate. In this case, because I'm only checking for required, it might be smarter to do it the other way. It's hidden. If it's bad, turn it on. Sure would be great. Visible, is that right? Visible, visible. There we go. It would be nice if that was true or false. And that one still bugs me that I have to remember that they're visible and hidden, and that's the only 2 properties. So why not true or false? We turn it on, and now how do we display the error message? I like to hover. And in order to get stuff to appear when I hover, you use the title property. So err.title equals, you must enter the username, or whatever error message you want. So what this does is it says, make that error marker go away. Let's assume everything's good. And then whenever we find something that's bad, we light it up and set the error message. In this case, there's only one error message. Couldn't we set the title up above here? Could. But I'm trying to be fairly consistent. In other locations, there are different ways to screw up numbers, different ways to screw up dates, so the error message changes as we go. Just doing it the same way here. I'm going to forget this if I don't do it now, so let's do it. Functions can return a value. What I like my validation functions to do is return either true or false. True meaning it's valid, and false meaning there's something wrong. My first instinct years ago was to put a variable in here and say what? I'm just gonna, is valid. Okay? Create a variable called isValid and initially set it to true. And then when I find something bad, we set isValid to false. But what occurred to me one day is if the error marker is on, it's bad. And if the error marker is off, it's good. So I can save myself a variable and just check the status of the error marker. err.style.visibility double equals comparing it to hidden. Because if it's hidden, then everything's good and I want to return a true. So in a way, I'm returning a Boolean value here that designates whether or not it was valid. I could rename the function. If Adam were here, he'd say, why don't you call the function isValidUsername? Well, because it does more than that. It also displays the error marker, displays error messages, and all those kinds of things. So I think this is a nice compromise. It returns a true, and it also turns on the error marker and sets the title. So let's give that a shot. This is required text. Better turn on the bug because I've been making lots of mistakes today. So far, so good. And there's my error marker already because I left to turn on the bug and my error marker showed up. Touch it. Title. Got it. Now the next test is, does it turn off again if I put something in here? Cool. Now this is a username, so I really wouldn't normally capitalize it. But I want to show you how to reformat this field if it needs capitalizing. So I'm going to put that in the else clause. Otherwise it's good, and let's capitalize it. Remember, we did this as well in programming logic. Then the ptr.value, remember that's what's in it, is equal to whatever it is right now to title case, if I remember right. And that's a function. To title case comes from Volcker tools. So hopefully the Volcker tools are in here someplace, probably in the index file. Volcker tools to title case. Notice that when you link these in, that happens in the web page. It doesn't happen in the JS file. I don't think there's a way in the JS file, because this is basically HTML. I don't think there's a way to link those other files in right in the JS file. I could be wrong. That'd be a handy thing to have. Put it in the JS file and have each JS library, because this is a library that we're building here. Unit 10 is a library. Each library only includes the stuff that it needs. All right, so let's test that one more time. And now when I type Volcker in there, I should get capitalized version. There we go. My to title case, I believe, capitalizes O'Keefe's and McDonald's appropriately. It also leaves other words like Gone with the Wind leaves the prepositions and all that kind of stuff alone, like it would in a title. It was written for my books read application, and so I have a lot of titles that I type in there. But it works well for names too. As long as your name doesn't include the word the, you're pretty good. It'll capitalize it for you. So that's the basics of validation. I have an error marker that's hiding out here. It's invisible when I create it on the form. Then I create an onBlur event in window onLoad. That event occurs as we're leaving the field, and I call the validation routine from in there. In the validation routine, I create a couple of pointers to the input and to its corresponding error marker. And then normally I will set the visibility to hidden, though you might put it to visible. And then turn it off. Depends on the circumstances. I kind of fluctuate with that. And then do your validation. If the validation has a problem, make the error marker visible and set its title. That way you get the error message. Otherwise, you might want to reformat or whatever else you're doing. Questions?
Would you ever be able to wire in the CSS that highlights a box to the error instead of using an error marker, or is that not possible?
No, you can change the style of an object, right? Because we're doing it here, right? We're changing the style visibility. You can also then get to the style.border and set its border property to something else.
Okay.
But then where do you display the error marker or the error message?
Wouldn't you get the error message when you hover over?
You could put it over the box, yeah.
The error thing. Okay.
Yeah, that's why the main reason I use the error marker is to somebody points to it and say, why, what's wrong, what's going on here? And yeah, you could do the same thing with the errors that are happening by changing the CSS here. I'm showing you how to get it started. There are other ways to do this. You know, many people don't like my error marker. I've seen skull and crossbones come in. They're 514 by 14. You can change the CSS. Knock yourself out.
Where is the error marker coming from?
It's just an image.
Image, and is it in here already, or is that just the browser image?
No, it's our form. At the end of every field, right there, is an image that's hidden. Every single field has that image. It's the same image for each one. It just each one has a different ID. Notice it has a different ID. That's what I'm referring to in the JavaScript. But they're all the same size. They're all hidden. They have a different ID. That's all that's different. You don't like my error marker? Create your own.
That's fine. I just
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just suggesting that if you don't like mine, absolutely create your own. And a couple of years ago, I think Jaron Yak, is that who it was? Yeah, it was Jaron. Somehow found a way to put the text there, but then he shrinks the field size down to nothing. And then when there's an error, then he expands it, and there's this arrow, and there's the red box, and he found some really cool CSS. Absolutely cool. Go for it. This, to me, does the job. And in his case, when there's an error, the whole thing pops up. Mine doesn't take up much room on the screen. That's the one thing I did notice about Jaron's is that when he displays the error message, if you're in a small window, sometimes that error message ends up getting wrapped into a different line or off the screen. Mine's just a little ball. And you touch it and you find out what's wrong. So I like the technique. If you wish to tweak it, I'm not going to argue with you. I don't think. Okay, back to the notes. That's the basics. We can also disable. Occasionally you want to disable objects on the form, depending on what's going on. That one's a little confusing because the property name is disabled. I'm going to put it in the code just so you have an example. And notice this one is a Boolean field. Still waiting for the latest versions of JavaScript to change visibility. It's a Boolean field, but it's not the enabled property that we're used to in Visual Studio. It's the disabled property. By default, that's always false. So I'm going to go up here to form load. And just to demonstrate this, and I'm done with the username, I'll keep it so I can steal stuff from it. Just to demonstrate it, I'm going to come down here, and there's a list box that's called list. I think it's fave. Is it color? There's fave class. There is a CMB fave color. We'll go with that. Now I'll do the list box. It's easier to see. LST fave class. Dot disabled equals true. Now that's going to do it on form load. You could do this on other circumstances. If you blur stuff and you find out that the user put in 0 as the second number, then you can disable or hide using visibility other objects on the form. Just showing you this, I don't think I asked you to use it for anything. Now this box, I found it interesting that I can scroll in it, but I can't click anything. It's disabled. Automatically goes gray. So that's how you do it, should you need to. Since it's buried in my notes, 2 lines on one set of notes. Okay, next thing we can do is deal with numbers. They're a little bit trickier. I have to be careful with numbers because we can't concatenate. Comparison generally works pretty good. But with numbers, we might have to check to see if it's numeric. Then we have to check to see if it's in range. So there's a number of things we need to do. We are going to learn about key press a little later. Once you add key press, the numeric checks go away. But initially, let's add them. We already have a pointer to pointer value. That's the text box that accepts supposedly an integer. And we've already set a min and a max for that. If there's a range, I recommend that you use the min and the max property of the object itself. All versions of browsers recognize min and max. And so in a way, these are constants, right? In my notes it says make a constant. Well, then I'd go up a little bit above window on load here and I'd make some constants. But if they're all defined in form on load, they're basically constants. They're easy to find. So I'm not going to define constants, I'm just going to put them in there. This was just to demonstrate that you can change the value. Don't really want to do that. And now under here, I still need a blur event. So ptr value dot onBlur equals validate the value. You need to provide the wiring station for every event that you want to handle. I usually put them all in window on load. Everything that I want to deal with, I put in window on load. We saw that there are other ways to do it, but they're just not as consistent and I'm going to say portable. So now we're validating a value, so that comes underneath here. Usually has a much better name like age or number of kids or whatever it is. And once again, same kind of stuff. Function, validate, value, parentheses, curly brackets. And now the PTR and the error come with me and the hide comes with me. I can just copy all of that and paste it down here. Change the names, txt value, could do a search and replace. Okay. And now I'm ready to go. This doesn't need to change. Now these two are pointing to the correct places. This is another common mistake. You copy and paste like I did and forget to update the names. And then all of a sudden the error markers are turning on for the wrong fields. They turn on, but they turn on for the wrong fields if you don't remember to update the names. Pardon me?
Or test it.
Or test it. Okay, so now how do I look for bad numbers? I'm first going to check to see if it's missing because we know that we can't convert that, parse int accepts the empty string and it says that's acceptable. That's an acceptable value. I don't know what the value is, but it's acceptable. So I'm going to first check to see if it's there. If the value, ptr.value, is not equal to the empty string. If it's not equal to the empty string, then I'm going to continue processing. Otherwise, I could put an else statement in here saying this is required. And that's when I steal this stuff. Well, this is optional. If the field is optional, they can skip it. Then we've just found a way to skip it. We just leave the else clause off. Leave the else clause off and it allows you to skip it and it doesn't yell at you. So just to demonstrate that, I think I'll comment this stuff out. That was dumb. Let's do it this way. That's better. So if it's not the empty string, if it is, we just skip all this and we say everything's cool. Because my error marker starts out hidden and it stays hidden. And down here at the bottom, there'll be a return statement just like that one. These return statements, by the way, we're going to use when we do form level validation. How do we know that the user has hit every one of the fields and put something in there, particularly for required fields? Before we submit the form, we're going to go through and hit every one of those fields and validate it to make sure it's good. Just in case. Because there's nothing that prevents the user from hitting submit, even though there's error markers on the form. The only thing that prevents the form from submitting is us. So we're going to validate each one of the fields, make sure everything's good, and each one of these functions get called, and if any one of them is false, then something's wrong. And we don't leave and we don't submit. So that's what these get used for. All right, it's not the empty string. What else could be bad? It could be non-numeric, right? I have to remember how I checked for non-numeric. All right, just do the is not a number, right? If is not a number of PTR value.
Do you want to do the opposite of that?
I could. Not is not a number, I could, and then keep processing if it is a number.
Isn't that what we're looking for?
We're looking for everything. So at this point, I'm going to say that's an error. Else must be a number, right? At this point, it's a number. And I'm going to do a little bit of experimenting. If the PTR value is less than the PTR min. Remember we defined in form load mins and maxes. Or PTR.value is greater than PTR.max. Well, wait a minute, isn't this a string and that's a number? Yeah, remember JavaScript's pretty flexible, it should adjust. That's what I'm hoping. Curly bracket. And back to Justin's question about, isn't what we're trying to do is figure out if it's good? If it's good, I'm not going to do anything here except maybe format it. So in this case, no, not really. What I'm looking for is bad stuff. And whenever it's bad, I turn the marker on. So in here, once again, I can steal my error messages because all I'm going to change is the message itself. Command control drag copies. And now I can get really elaborate with my error messages if I wish. Else, it's good. Now notice in this example that if I'd left this in down here, in 1, 2, 3 different places I set the visibility to visible. Maybe it would have been smarter to start it off at visible and then in the else clause down here say hide it. Maybe. I kind of like this, doesn't take much typing. And it says, if there's a problem, turn on the error marker and set this message. If there's a problem down here, turn on the error marker, set this message. Next year I'll change my mind. So let's see how that goes. Doink. PTR, forgot something. Text value, got missing a quote there. That's why that's still black, I was wondering. Syntax missing a curly bracket. Really? That's the end of that if. I need the end of that if. Indentation. Helps me at least find them if I can't remember where to put those in. There we go. How come this isn't clearing? I think somewhere up here in my form load I commented that out. This is what Firefox does. Even when you refresh the page, it leaves the data. Maybe that's not so bad. It's the gone wind isn't in the way. Now, this is a number. I missed a step here. How am I going to type a number out of range? I can. Can I leave it out? And nothing gets yelled at. Okay. Can I type text in here? Yes, but notice I don't get my error marker. Because the numeric up down, the number field does not return a value if you give it text. It gives you junk, gives you the empty string, which we said is okay. Oops. So because that's a number field, I'm getting little side effects here of my HTML5 interacting with my JavaScript that you'll have to deal with. I know it's a number. So maybe down here I would say, I would modify my code because I know it's a number, and I'm going to change it to a text field here in just a second. Okay. Maybe I would modify this and turn this on and say that's not a recognizable value. Or you must enter a valid number, and that way it kind of says it's blank, that's not valid, and whatever you typed, it's not valid. It should get caught down here. And this part up here, that's not a valid number. Never happens because the number type intercepts it. At least in Firefox. Go ahead.
Can you check if the HTML5 is bad? If the number is causing the error itself on the form, can you send it to JavaScript?
There's a CSS that says it's bad, right? But I don't.
If you use that way, you can leave it as a number and then still intercept it.
Or the question would be, is there a property in the number type that gives me the text? I don't know. what you're asking is, can I get to the CSS, which is the dot style, and then see if it's valid, right? Because I forget what the CSS is already. There's some CSS that we can apply, that we did apply, colon valid. So is this something we can get at? Well, let's find out. I don't know if that's true or false or what that would be.
Valid email.
So it's your dot value.
That's another question. No, because I'm talking about the style now. I can go to the value, but that gives me the value returned by the object, which is empty if I type text in a number field. Didn't turn on the error marker, so there may be a way to do it. I don't know what it is just yet. Seems to me if the style is there, I should be able to look at it. But remember, the style of visibility is visible, but the other one, the enabled, that wasn't a style, was it? No, it's not a style. So it might be validity.valid or.
Well, you could check on, you could just say, if, like, you could say.
You guys can experiment. Let's move on.
You were saying you can change the border color using the object, so you can just check to see the border color and say, is it equal to black?
To do that. If you have, now you're mixing, now I'm a little concerned because you're mixing on purpose the CSS with the JavaScript. Right? And particularly the CSS, I'll be thinking, why would the border color change? Where's the code in the JavaScript that changes the border color? There is no code in the JavaScript that changes the border color. That's tricky. Now I got to go, remember, I have to think, unless you document it, of course, I have to think to go to the CSS and see the validation CSS. Okay, I tried. If you want to try and teach me something, go for it. And we were testing this. I can get below the mins and the maxes. So the text part with a number, before I forget, let's change it. Just temporarily. I'm going to go back to my integer value and turn it back into a text field so you can see what happens. Now when I type text in there, I get a, what did you do? I forgot to save everybody. I get an error saying that's not a valid number. Right? That I could not get with the number field. If I type in a number, so I've checked that, I can leave it blank because we said that's legal. Error marker goes away, that's good to see. And then go below range, which is 1. And above range. 5 is a good test. 6 should be legal. Why do I test 5? If I put an equal sign in instead when I shouldn't have in my condition, if it's less than or equal to 5, not normally what you would do, but tell me you've never typed the equal sign when you shouldn't. Did I leave? I did leave. Why is it still yelling at me?
Same thing again. Once it invalidates the number, it stays. Just refresh.
Why is it doing that? My guess is we mix types, right? Always a bad idea. My guess is instead of converting this string to a number, it converted this number to a string. And what happens when you start comparing strings? You get ugly stuff like 10 is 1. And we said if it's greater than 10 alphabetically, that's just about every number, isn't it? So that's what's happening here. Oops. It's a good thing I have my if statement here. Let's create a variable called entered value, and that's going to be equal to % of ptr.value. And then we check the entered value to see if it's out of range. Now it likes 7, still likes 5, doesn't like 4, likes 10, but not 11. So now we're smarter than we were before, but I'm going to forget that. I think the lesson learned there is try not to do mixed type stuff like mixed type math, even though when you do math, JavaScript will convert your strings into numbers because you're doing math. There, it almost burned us if we hadn't tested it thoroughly. Would have burned us to say it works because it was, good thing I tested 5 and 6 just above and below because I got errors when I shouldn't have. But if I hadn't tested those, the error markers were coming on. I might have been happy, going merrily on my way. But what we now know is, and for comparison purposes, it changed the min to a string instead of the string to a number. Interesting.
I wonder if you put the reverse, say pointer min is greater than entered value, the pointer dot value. Put the int first.
I don't think, oh, I see what you're saying. And then since it's first, it would convert them to a number.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a lot to remember, isn't it? Whatever's first is the type we're using. I'd much rather do this manually convert it to an integer than compare integers because that's what I'm doing. So his suggestion, in case it didn't hit the recording, is what happens if I flip these around and put the PTR mins in front. First of all, it doesn't read the way I want it to read. I am more interested in my value being less than the min or greater than the max than I am the min being bigger than my value. Or less than my value. See, I don't even know how to say it. But I've seen plenty of programming logic beginning students write it that way. Okay, so that seems to work. But as text, I'm not a big fan of using text for numbers. So let's put it back to numbers and see if we can get our JavaScript to play well with it. And what I anticipated was that this is no longer a factor. Now, should I leave it there to confuse you?
Is it worth leaving it in just in case someone uses junky browser?
Pardon me?
Is it worth leaving it in just in case someone uses a junky browser?
You could, and it won't hurt anything, right? Because once we get here, okay, that's an interesting point. I can leave it in there, say this is not a valid number in case we're using a really old browser that doesn't have numeric up-downs. And I think, by the way, that really old browser, IE10, I'm not positive. I was going to test that in my office and never got around to it. I got sidetracked. IE11 does have a numeric up-down. Okay, so here we have this stuff. We'll leave it in there. But I want to change this error message. We'll make this an error, first of all. Oh boy, there has got to be a way to get to the text of that when it's a numeric field. Some of the browsers wipe it out when you leave. Firefox doesn't, it just leaves it. and actually submits it, I think. I'll have to test that. Anyways, come back in here. And here. And say you must enter a valid value in this field. So that's kind of my generic error message saying you gave me a number or you left it blank.
Interesting enough, if you leave it as a number field, the comparison still fails. If you don't do the parse in first.
If I don't do the parse string first,
If you don't do the parse int on the entered value with the numeric field,
but I'm checking to see if it's empty first, how would I get in there?
no, when you enter in a number that's in range,
Yeah,
where we had before where it was converted into a string,
yeah.
it does that even if it's a number field. It gives you the text back.
So it's a string instead of a.
It's giving you back a string.
Is because you have the string as your first thing in comparison.
Are you back to flipping these things around?
No, I've got it the same way, but I never changed mine to a text field, and that if still failed, even though I was using a number field.
Yeah, because you have this, you're comparing this.
So for the value.
Yes,
it's
yes,
still
okay,
giving
all right,
me a
thank you.
string.
Okay, now for the recording. What he was doing is he left this out saying, hey, it's a number field, or it will be. It's a numeric up down. It returns a number, right? Oh no. Still returns a string. Which is good to know that we still need to convert it to an integer because what we're getting out of this number field is a string, just like when you enter a date. In a date field, you get a string, ISO formatted string. That's what comes out. Okay, what I'm curious about here is if I hit F55 here, what's it going to do to me? It's going to say that's not between 5 and 10. Cool. Let me type it. If I type junk in here, then I get an error message that says you must enter, I'm down here. So I'm going to turn on my JavaScript breakpoint and take a look around in there, see what's going on. Anybody figure out why it chooses this instead of that as its primary JavaScript, or this? You could figure out how to get those to go in a certain order. But anyways, come down here, let's put in a breakpoint. Because I want to see what the actual value is. Is that the one I want? Nope, that one. Leave. And there's the breakpoint. Now I can look at ptr.value is equal to the empty string / null. So it treats it, because I've got garbage in there, it treats it as the empty string. And it processes down to this error message.
If you put a number inside of junk, does it
Can I put a number inside here?
like?
I understand. Yep, that's a good question. I think I can put it in the front, but not in the back.
Junk, number, and then junk.
I said go. Did I hit it again? Oh no, don't lock up with me now. I got things to do. Well, must be a good time for a break.
So if that says null, could you just make it just stand for null?
Pardon me? Could I check for null?
Yeah.
Good question. Right now in Firefox, I can't do anything.
Is there anything you set your mind to?
Hit F5, that did it. Still going to stop the recording.